In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told. Stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories. The accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that changed the world. Let us begin by traveling into a past long forgotten, yet still echoing into our present. The Eastern Roman Empire, often called Byzantine, lasted over 1,000 years. It survived its Western partner by nearly a full millennium. How does an empire that fell in Rome rise again by the Bosporus? Why did a new capital built by Constantine become the true heir to Roman power? We will see the political crises, the strategic landing, the religious changes that shaped this new empire. We will look at the reforms of Diocletian, the end of rule by four emperors and the Edict of Milan. These events prepared the way for Constantinople. We will find sieges, debates about faith, imperial changes, and the long path from a golden age under Justinian to the final end in 1453. The 3rd century opened with Roman power stretched and trust broken. Emperors rose and fell through military revolts. Legions on the borders fought each other as much as for enemies. In the provinces, money lost value, taxes were hard to gather, and merchants held back goods. Goths crossed the Danube River. Franks tested the Rhine line. In the east, a strong Persian state challenged Roman defenses. Cities built up their walls and watched trade routes change. The empire still called itself one realm, but it felt like separate regions held by custom and fear. From this world came a soldier from the Balkans, Diocletian. His path moved through army camps, not the halls of Rome. He saw the chaos as a problem to manage. The state needed clear, steady money and separate roles for soldiers and tax collectors. He redrew provincial lines to make areas smaller. He increased the number of governors and put supervisors above them. He divided military leaders from those who collected money and sent inspectors to check both. The message was clear: rules and ranks would secure power. The size of the empire forced his next choice. Distance and slow travel meant one court could not handle threats on the Rhine, Danube and Euphrates at once. Diocletian named a partner as co-emperor and then 2 deputies to support them. This role by mapped a human solution onto the land. To senior leaders with to junior, ones each with an area of operation, a capital and a staff. Laws issued with shared names showed unity, while messengers and files moved in parallel. In practice, this recognized an east and west for administration, without a legal split. Each half had its treasuries, weapons, and traveling courts. Yet the system claimed a single Roman order, with shared policy and law. Coins, titles, and ceremonies showed a clear chain of command, so officials knew who to follow. The eastern half gained from its wealth. Syria and Egypt sent cash, crops, and trade taxes into imperial accounts. City networks around Antioch, Alexandria, and Asia Ina supported workshops, shipping, and courts. The Danube and Taurus Mountains offered defense lines that, with roads and supply posts, could be held from nearby hubs. Meanwhile, in much of the west, larger states, spread towns grew thin and defense lines stretched over long frontiers with less money. To pay soldiers and keep things moving, Diocletian set standard requests, tied work duties to land, and fixed tax amounts with new surveys. He strengthened forts with more posts and placed forces to respond to raids. Recruitment tied families to army service through and grants in border zones. These steps built a system with habits strong enough to outlast several emperors. Culture and politics followed language. Latin remained the voice of law and army orders in many regions, but Greek ruled the markets and town offices of the East. Courts closer to Nicomedia and Antioch worked with Greek-speaking clerks, while Western elites kept old Roman Senate custom. The result was smoother rule in the East and deeper cultural divides across the empire. New centers rose to match these facts. Nicomedia held an imperial court with records, treasuries, and workshops. Antioch managed eastern military campaigns and tax collection. Plans for more investment along the Bosporus hinted at a future pivot that would later become Constantinople. In 305, Diocletian stepped down by choice, setting example no emperor had dared before. He left behind a model of shared rule and close watch that others would take and fight to control. When crisis returned and messengers asked him to lead again, he stayed in his garden. Constantine came to power with a different goal than fixing a failing center. He wanted a capital that could signal a fresh start, a Roman state with enough reach to govern armies and trade across the continents. Rome had history, but its politics ran through old Senate networks. Its city fabric weakened with decline and it far from the money sources in the east. Constantine needed distance from those problems and a place that could direct grain, gold, and men with less delay. He found it in Byzantium, a small Greek city guarding the narrow waters where the Black Sea meets the Mediterranean. The site controlled movement like a gatekeeper. Any fleet leaving Black Sea ports passed its shores. Caravans from Anatolian Thrace met there before roads spread out again. Ships could move north to the Danube or south to the Levant with speed. The land sold itself. Deep harbors, high ground and a shore that forced attackers into open areas. Constantine did not settle for an army camp. He rewrote the city plan. Crews extended the city walls to include more hills and neighborhoods, laid new streets and put power into ceremonial spaces. Markets with columns held trade and imperial announcements. Palaces and government halls brought the court into daily view of the people. New aqueducts crossed the countryside to bring water for a larger population and soldiers. Above it, all the hippodrome became a civic engine, part stadium, part political theater, where groups' petitions and imperial presence met in one arena. He calls the project a new Rome, but not a copy. The institutions of empire took their places in a city whose language and habits leaned Greek. Christian churches rose beside state buildings, including a burial church for emperors at the Church of the Holy Apostles. Processions tied the calendar of rule to the calendar of worship. The court and the church developed routines that taught people how power would look and sound in the new order. Defense shaped every choice. Water surrounded the peninsula. On 3 sides and shipyards lined the Golden Horn to keep fleets ready. Along the land, approach space remained to add huge walls as the city grew. A plan future rulers would complete with multiple walls, towers, and a ditch. Supply lines by sea helped during sieges. Grain ships could slip into the safe harbor, even when land routes were cut. The capital was built to outlast pressure. Constantine treated the city like a museum of empire and a workshop for legitimacy. Artisans set up foundries and mints. Statues, columns, and monuments came from every corner. Pieces of older cities were reused to state the old world now spoke through this one. Pagan masterpieces stood not for worship, but as signs of rank and heritage. The effect was immediate. Merchants followed demand. Scholars sought support and pilgrims visited holy sites that link faith to authority. The change moved through the map. Money flows turned toward the Bosporus. Eastern provinces found shorter paths to court and contracts. Governors sent cases and appeals eastward. Over time, the pull of Constantinople locked in an eastern path for imperial policy and military plans. Stories later said Constantine placed a fragment of the true cross under his memorial column, a gesture tying the city's foundation to a sacred trust that for 1,000 years shaped its purpose and confidence. Constantine's public life began in the world of old gods and imperial rights, but his politics moved a new way after civil war pushed him to the center of power. As he secured his rule, the gap between his early ties and his later choices widened. He did not announce a sudden change so much as make a series of decisions that linked his rule to Christian communities, bishops, and symbols. These carried a different moral weight than Rome's older gods. By the time his new capital rose on the Bosporus, the ruler who once sacrificed at imperial altars now sought churches as pillars of the state. The key moment came with the Milvian Bridge campaign in 312 against Maxentius. A count still of a vision before battle and a sign he linked to the Christian god. He ordered his soldiers to mark their gear with a Christian symbol and marched into a fight that ended with his rival deadened, his own position safe. For Constantine, the result proved the choice to align power with the faith's protective sign. It also brought a political language that framed victories as proof of divine support, not personal luck or civic rituals. From that point, policy followed belief. In 313, Hieronymus issued measures known as the Edict of Milan. It gave legal freedom to worship across the empire and returned taken property to Christian groups. The state no longer punished Christians for their meetings or scriptures. Instead, governors got orders to help return property. This reduced legal friction, opened government roles to Christian advisors, and cleared the way for imperial gifts to churches. Imperial support then built a visible map of the new order. Constantine gave bishops land, paid clergy, and sent imperial resources into big projects. He ordered large basilicas where crowds would gather and where the court could show presence at major feasts. In Jerusalem, building focused on the site honored as the place of Jesus, assessed death and right. In Rome, a huge church rose near the graves of martyrs. These buildings did more than host worship. They anchored pilgrimage, drew craftsmen, and turned holy sites into engines of city revival. Unity, however, needed shared belief. Arguments over how to speak of Christ's nature threatened to split communities across provinces. In 325, Constantine called bishops to Nicaea under imperial peace. They made a creed that set limits for teaching on worship. The emperor enforced the council's decisions with exile orders and letters that treated clear belief as a matter of public order. Church and state began to share tools, summons, records, and provincial networks to keep common norms. The result was a ruler who governed through ritual and council, as much as through law and army. He kept the legal machine of Rome while weaving Christian times, symbols, and institutions into it. Artists used Christian themes for imperial monuments. Laws drew on bishops as judges in disputes. Identities stretched. Soldiers, notaries, officials, and city councils learned to see Christian festivals and processions as part of city life. The empire gained a new language of legitimacy. Constantine delayed baptism until the end of his life, a choice that fit the time while keeping flexibility as he managed a diverse people. Meanwhile, supporters moved wealth toward the church. Sources speak of temple treasures and gifts sent to Christian foundations. This moved precious metals, land, income, and artistic skill into a new institutional core. In doing so, he tied prosperity and faith together, and he set expectations that future emperors would make laws, build, and defend in the name of the Christian Commonwealth. When Theodosius, his side, died in 395, the imperial seal split for good. He had kept the map under one hand. His sons inherited halves. The western court moved between Milan and Ravenna, a growing defensive and reactive. The east stayed fixed to Constantinople, where treasuries, fleets, and records concentrated. From that year forward, cooperation depended on talk, not command. The western half struggled to pay soldiers and keep allies. Tax debts grew as estates took over small farms. Money lost value in the countryside, and officials relied more on goods taken in kind, which bred avoidance and anger. Power drifted to generals and court favorites who moved through short week rules. Allied groups, Visigoths, Vandals, and others received land or payments for service, but those deals frayed under shortages and mistrust. The border became a negotiation space, not a line. Across the Balkans and in Gaul, local governors faced moving groups who wanted secure homes more than plunder. Yet fights broke out when promises failed. The sack of Rome in 410 by Visigoths showed the limits of Western coordination. A famous city with little strategic value suffered because talks collapsed. 2 decades later, the Vandals crossed into North Africa and cut the Western tax base by taking provinces that supplied oil, grain, and trade taxes. In 429, their foothold became a source of ships and fighters the West could not remove. By contrast, the Eastern Empire leaned on dense city networks and a tighter money core. Alexandria, Antioch, and the cities of Asia Minor kept artisans, shipyards, and courts alive. Constantinople's system set standard procedures, checked governors, and kept mint output that paid soldiers on time. Wall projects In Thrace and around the capital pushed attackers into prepared zones. The capital's sea routes ensured grain came when land paths failed, and its diplomats bought time with payments and deals that cost less than wars. As the West faltered, the East took the role of keeper of Roman civilization. Law schools gathered and explained imperial ruling. Court ceremony hardened into a script that taught subjects what sovereignty looked like. Libraries and writing workshops kept texts and commentaries. Even as provincial losses grew in the West, Constantinople held triumphs, processions and legal sessions that reinforced continuity. The Western unraveling sped up through mid-century. North Africa's law starved Ravenna of money. Armies in Gaul and Italy fought civil wars that emptied ranks needed for defense. Generals sought legitimacy by controlling puppet emperors, but each turn overbled authority. In 476, a commander named Dodo Acer removed the young Romulus Augustus and sent the imperial symbols to Constantinople. Western rule did not vanish overnight. Local officials and kings reused Roman tools. Still, the Western title went dark. Eastern emperors refused to treat the West as gone. They addressed new rulers as officials, not equals, and called former Western provinces temporarily out of hand. In Constantinople, the idea of a single empire lived on, with the Bosporus city acting as the real new Rome. Its courts issued laws in Latin for a time, then more in Greek. As language habits changed, churches matched worship and belief, with imperial policy and religious identity deepened around the capital's bishops and monasteries. The split brought an odd benefit to the East. Without Western costs, endless Rhine campaigns supporting failing administrations, propping up distant ports, the Eastern budget focused on its own frontiers and fleets. Over the next centuries, that focus helped it adapt and survive. And when word reached the Bosporus that an Italian strongman had dismissed a boy emperor, many residents did not pause their day. For them, Rome lived where the emperor sat, under the gold and purple of Constantinople. Justinian entered the palace with a goal beyond daily rule. He wanted Rome restored in fact, not ceremony. A Mediterranean map stitched back under one authority. He cultivated the image of a successor to Caesar and Augustus, yet he approached the task like a systems engineer, aligning courts, armies and clergy toward a single center of command. The claim was simple: the empire had been damaged, not destroyed, and Constantinople held the tools to repair it. His time came with a memory of distance from power. Born in the Balkans to a peasant family, he rose because his uncle Justin fought his way to the throne and brought his nephew to the capital. That background sharpened Justinian's hunger for legitimacy. He read reports, corrected notes, and kept secretaries working through the night. His schedule told officials what to expect: no slack, no tolerance for officers that treated imperial rules as suggestions. Inside government, his method was consolidation. He cut overlapping offices, promoted trusted aides, and pushed for uniform steps across provinces. He tightened watch on tax lists and supply to keep armies ready without giving power to provincial magnates. He used imperial orders to define what judges could accept as precedent and how appeals should move upward. The center would write the language, the provinces would speak it. That doctor peaked in the Codex Justinianus, the first stage of a larger law project that gathered centuries of rules and judgments into an organized whole. Teams of legal experts sifted through contradictions, removed old clauses and arranged text so governors and lawyers could actually use them. The result gave courts a common reference and made imperial will clear from North Africa to the Danube. Over later centuries, that body shaped legal thinking far beyond the empire's shrinking borders. His eye moved from law to stone. Building programs announced faith and power at ground level. He funded churches, hospitals and government halls, and he planned city spaces to guide processions between palace and sanctuary. Architecture served as a statement: the ruler governed by God's favor, and the city skyline should teach it. After the capital shook with violent unrest, he ordered a new cathedral on a scale beyond memory. Hagia Sophia's vast canopy spread over a light-filled nave. Its dome seemed to float above a ring of windows that turned weight into brilliance. It became the visual shorthand for Byzantine confidence and skill. Beyond the capital, Justinian gambled on a fort. He aimed first at North Africa, where restoring tax flows quick returns, and then at Italy, where the old administrative heartlands held symbolic weight. He relied on quick commanders and fleets to break enemies fast before fatigue and distance drained momentum. Each campaign needed patience and siege gear. Each success required soldiers, governors, and payments to hold the ground. The costs mounted. Diplomacy on the eastern frontier had to keep Persia quiet while western armies marched. Money from retaken lands came slower than hoped, and local wars lasted longer than planned timetables. The emperor pressed on, convinced that risk today secured order tomorrow. He remained a figure of contradictions, bold in scope, firm in method, faithful in purpose, and heavy in the burdens he set. Through all of it, one partner shaped outcomes inside the palace and in the streets. Theodore's counsel and resolve made policy possible when events threatened to break it, and Hearst Arms soon met its test. Justinian, for his part, never called his realm anything but Rome reborn under a new capital and an old claim. On race days, the hippodrome pulled the city into one part. Tens of thousands watched teams race around the central spine while petitions, shouts, and chants rolled down from the tiers. Officials appeared in the imperial box to read orders. Faction leaders exchanged signals. Beneath the show, grievances moved as fast as bets. The arena doubled as a forum where loyalty could be measured in noise and discontent could harden into pressure. Those crowds sorted themselves into blues and greens. The labels came from colors on the carriateras tunics, but the factions ran through neighborhoods, guilds, and support networks. They funded races and stables, but also lawyers and street enforcers. Local leaders could use them to deliver votes, raise donations, or stage protests. Rivalries spilled beyond sport and fights, sometimes bled into markets and church squares. Officials had to manage not just crime but coalition politics wrapped in team banners. By 500 Tito, the financial edge of Justinian's program cut into many groups at once. Tax collectors pressed for old debts. New audits closed loopholes elites had long enjoyed. Merchants took losses when monopolies tightened. Price controls broke. Small shopkeepers faced inspectors while town councils got orders without funds to obey. The reforms promised order, but the pace bred anger. Faction clashes offered a spark near a pile of dry wood. An arrest after a street fight became the fuse that set everything off. Executions, set for several offenders, were watched and survivors fled to a church shelter. Blues and greens, for once found common cause, demanded mercy, denounced corrupt officials, and pushed back against the financial squeeze. When the emperor refused to yield, the hippodrome erupted. Shouts roared from the stands as the crowd called for victory over the palace, not the rival team. Fires jumped from quarter to quarter. Market halls, baths, and the old cathedral burned. For days the city asked or turned into barricades undashed. Inside the palace pan, expired. Advisors urged flight to the harbours where ships waited. The sense in the halls was that rule had slipped and any delay risked being trapped. Theodora had already shown a skill for reading crowds and courts. Her resolve cut through the fear, and the runes shifted around a plan to retake the city rather than leave it. Orders went to the generals. Units spread through streets to isolate pockets of resistance, while Belisarius and the guards set a trap at the hippodrome. With promises and threats, they drew rebels inside for a supposed top. Gates shut, armed lines advanced from both ends. The crush turned into slaughter. When the killing stopped, tens of thousands lay deadened. The revolt ended in one blow that scarred Constantinople for years. The aftermath changed the balance inside the regime. Theodora emerged as a co-architect of policy. Petitioners learned that access to her could decide cases, and officials adjusted to a two-voiced court. Laws soon reflected her priorities. Rules that strengthened women's ability to start divorce, secured armies, hold property alone, and resist force in brothels. These measures moved through the same machine that had tightened taxes months earlier. But now the targets were predators and the loopholes that shielded them. Work crews cleared rubble, cut new fire breaks and reopened aqueducts. The emperor sent resources to rebuild at a scale that would overwrite the memory of Ash. Plans for a new cathedral exceeded anything the city had seen, and the sight of loss became the stage for a statement in stone and light on the hippodrome floor. Meanwhile, factions returned to racing under heavy watch, and briefly, even they saw how close they had come to replacing the emperor inside that very arena. Belisarius first appeared as the kind of commander court rivals underestimate. Young, spare, and speech exacting with drill, he trained mixed armies, Byzantine regulars, his own household horsemen, and allied Hun horse archers into units that could move fast and hit harder than their numbers suggested. Reports of his early border fights against Persians showed a habit of setting ambushes with mobile wings and keeping a disciplined infantry to hold ground. Justinian saw in him a tool for a larger plan. That plan aimed at the Western. If the empire could bring back key provinces, tax money and prestige would follow. North Africa offered the clearest opening. The Vandal kingdom controlled Carthage, the grain route and shipyards that once supplied Roman fleet. Italy promised higher symbolism, Ravenna, and the old administrative spine, but also hard fighting. Justinian chose Africa first to prove the model and fund the rest. In 533, Belisarius sailed from Constantinople with a compact force, a few tens of thousands of men strong, and cavalry carried by a fleet built under tight secrecy and strict apply contract. He landed near Caput, kept the march tight to avoid upsetting locals, and met the Vandals into decisive clashes. At Adek Imam, he used flexible cavalry screens to blunt a larger force and turned a near disaster into a routed enemy. Soon after at Tricamarum, he pressed the advantage before the Vandal command recovered. Within months, Carthage opened its gates and imperial rule resumed. The speed shocked observers. Warehouses reopened. The mint struck coins with imperial portraits, and officials checked estates that had changed hands under Vandal rule. Belisarius sent captured banners and prisoners to Constantinople, signaling the province, and its trade taxes were back in the imperial column. Garrisons spread along the coast, and naval patrols secured sea lanes. For a moment the reconquest looked efficient, almost routine. Italy did not. In 535 the army crossed to Sicily, took ports, and then moved on to the peninsula. Belisarius entered Rome in 536, re-establishing an imperial presence inside its walls for the first time in decades. The Gothic war that followed dragged year after year. Sieges cut aqueducts, emptied granaries. People fled to fortified hill towns. Fields lay fallow, workshops closed, and tax collectors found ruins where ledgers had listed home. Disease and famine shadowed both armies. Belisarius kept working with the tools he trusted: mobility, spy networks, and fair treatment of civilians. Cities sometimes surrendered when he guaranteed property and lives, a policy that saved walls and won allies. Yet the court grew nervous about his standing with soldiers and local elite. At key moments Justinian recalled him or split his camp, and pushing him to accept triumphs at home, momentum slipped abroad. Supplies arrived late, reinforcements came in pieces, and rival generals diluted authority. Even with those limits, the general's record was solid. Ravenna gave up after a campaign of pressure and talks that opened the gates without a storm. Large parts of Italy returned to imperial colors, but holding them proved costly. Highmaesters scraped coins from a strained treasury. Requisitions fed soldiers but starved town markets. The countryside's loss of workers and livestock shrank revenue, just as defense needs spiked. In the end, the map looked better on paper than in practice. Africa stabilized, though not without revolts. Italy became a ledger of gains offset by exhaustion. The empire carried the weight of new frontiers while its core faced rising costs and thin reserves. Belisarius remained the loyal to leave, and when sidelined, his restraint a rare constant in a brutal war. Later storytellers would claim he died blinded, unbegging, a likely fiction that held a truth about the era. Glory came with risk, and reward rarely matched service. Soon a different kind of foe would test all those gains at once. The story turns from campaigns to sickness. After years of rebuilding the capital, setting laws and marching armies west, the empire met a silent invader. In 540, when a pandemic arrived that later generations would link to the same germ behind the medieval Black Death, the suddenness mattered. One shipping season life ran on familiar schedules. The next ports received cargo and quotas in the same holds. The route followed trade. Grain ships and merchant caravans moved from the Nile Delta and Red Sea links to the Aegean and from there to the Bosporus. Constantinople less density, dock workers, clerks, sailors, soldiers gave the sickness a perfect ladder. Markets stayed open because food had to move. Processions and councils kept calendars because government needed rhythm. That regular motion spread infection faster than officials could count. Crisis showed in the streets. Carts failed to keep pace with the dead. Burial teams dug trenches beyond the walls, then filled them and dug more. When space ran out, authorities stacked bodies inside towers and along stretches of wall. Priests, officials, and doctors fell ill alongside laborers. Even the imperial household felt it. Justinian caught the plague and nearly died. He recovered, but those close to him noted slower choices, sharper suspicions, and a court that closed ranks. The population shock hit every system at once. Guesses of the time suggest losses that in some areas erased up to half the people. Fields lacked hands, planting schedules slipped, harvests shrank, and granaries ran low. Tax lists thinned, audits found empty homes, and collectors faced communities that could not meet demands. Army rolls showed gaps. Units merged to keep banners in the field, but veterans' losses hollowed experience, and recruitment pulled boys into ranks earlier than planned. On maps, villages vanished from later records because they never recovered. Military strain followed. The retaken West had promised money and pride, yet it now demanded ships, soldiers, and payments that outpaced returns. African estates revolted. Italian towns changed hands when pay failed, and border posts reported shortages. Meanwhile, old rivals tested the edges. Persian forces pressed eastern provinces. Gothic leaders regrouped in the Alps. Slavic groups crossed the Danube into Balkan lands, settling in pockets the state could no longer patrol consistently. Money told the same story. Rebuilding after the Nika fires had already drawn on reserves. Western wars had consumed coin for sieges, fleets, and bonuses. Then the plague removed workers, raised prices, and slowed trade. Contracts lapsed because contractors died, workshops closed, and mints struggled to keep output steady without lowering standards. The math turned brutal: fewer taxpayers, higher defense costs, and emergency spending to keep the capital supplied. Administrators improvised, but the center felt the drag. By the last years of Justinian's rule, the empire still looked strong on ceremonial days. Triumphs rolled through the streets. Hagia Sophia's dome still caught morning light. Yet beneath the surface the machine ran hot. Lines of talk stretched thin. Commanders argued over rations, and provincial governors wrote back asking for help they rarely received. The state remained larger than its neighbors, but weakness crept into routine. After Justinian's death, those who followed inherited borders that could no longer be watched as planned. They gave some ground by treaty, abandoned others by needing concentrated resources where survival required it. Expansion gave way to triage. Over the next decades, wars, movements, and new religious currents pushed the empire into choices that would reshape institutions and identity. For a time, one number captured the memory of 541. At the peak, Constantinople may have lost as many as 10,000 people per day, and officials ran out of burial ground, stacking bodies inside walls and in abandoned fort towers. By the early 600s, the empire carried scars from decades of spending and sickness. Money came slower than needs, soldiers stretched across too many fronts, and politics in the capital cycled through coups and purges. That weakness invited pressure. Enemies read the books correctly. The state looked large on maps but thin in strength. Provinces that once fed the budget now asked for aid. Ports still handled grain and taxes, yet the extra that paid for counterattacks had dried up. In 610, Heraclius arrived from North Africa and took the throne amid the turmoil. He inherited empty treasuries, a low-spirit army, and a war no one in the palace could direct. Border commanders sent dark reports. The general staff had no clear plan. Across the frontier, Khosrow, I moved fast, confident Byzantium would collapse under pressure. Heraclius faced a choice: accept losses and bargain, or rebuild capacity at speed. The Persian campaign advanced in layers. Persian forces took fortresses in Mesopotamia and pushed into Syria. Provincial capitals fell, supplied depots changed hands, and local elites hedged bets by making deals with the invaders. Palestine followed, then the Nile provinces. Egypt's grain and trade taxes slipped from the imperial legion, with it the margin that once funded fleets. In Anatolia, towns along key roads were sacked or held by Persian troops, cutting lines between the interior and the capital. Jerusalem's fall in 614 carried more than strategic weight. The city's capture signaled to Christians across the empire that holy places lay unprotected. The loss of the true cross's war loot struck at the heart of imperial identity, which had tied God's favor to Roman order. Pilgrimage routes broke, monasteries emptied, and bishops in distant provinces wrote letters that read like laments. In Constantinople, processions turned from celebration to prayer. By 617, the crisis neared the straits. Avars and Slavs pressed from the Balkans, while Persian armies tested western Anatolia. The capital faced siege threats by London's sea. Military pay fell behind. Heraclius lacked cash and time. He answered by reorganizing. He cut unneeded costs, restructured mint issues, and pledged church items as promised to raise gold for soldier pay and supplies. He trimmed extra posts, unshifted resources into mobile field armies. Then he gambled on attack. Rather than bleed on the defense line near the Bosporus, he marched across Anatolia and struck into Persian land. The move forced Khosrow to react. Heraclius built alliances with steppe powers and used mountain paths to avoid static strongholds. Campaign seasons stacked one after another. Winter marches, quick strikes on depots, and raids that wrecked Persian supply lines. He kept his army small enough to move and fed it from captured stores. The turn came in 627 near Nineveh. Heraclius drew the Persian field force into open battle and won by precision and endurance. The defeat shook the Sassanid elite. Khosrow fell soon after to a palace revolt. With leadership broken, Persian garrisons negotiated withdrawal. Frontiers rolled back toward earlier lines as the two tired states sought terms. In 630, Heraclius escorted the True Cross back to Jerusalem. The act restored prestige and offered a story of deliverance. Yet the victory masked strain. The treasury sat empty. The army needed rest and recruits. And the eastern provinces had lost people and farm. Recovery required time the empire would not receive. From the Arabian Peninsula, a new power gathered speed, and its first probes met border post, still counting losses from the last war. Medieval writers called Heraclius' campaign a miracle of leadership, because by any measure Byzantium should have died here and did not. As Byzantium and Persia staggered out of years of war, a new force formed on the southern horizon. By the early 7th century, communities across the Arabian Peninsula united under the message preached by the Prophet Muhammad. After his death, leadership passed to the caliphs, who organized resources, law, and command structures with speed. Their state fused belief with administration, tax systems, garrisoned towns, and judges traveling with armies. Against them stood an empire that had just bled itself to save its borders. Byzantium held great cities and famous walls, but it was overstretched, cash poor, and short on veterans. The balance shifted quickly. Arab armies moved with coordinated columns, using camel supply lines that crossed deserts Roman maps treated as barriers. They aimed at nodes, not just open ground, river crossings, depots, and provincial capitals. The Byzantine field force at Yarmouk in 636 broke under pressure after days of moves on bad ground. With Syria lost local money recruitment bases and a path to Mesopotamia vanished from imperial reach. Egypt followed soon after. Control of the Nile's grain and the taxes of Alexandria slipped from Constantine, the low palace box removing the safety net that had cushioned shortages for centuries. Over the next decades, pressure rolled west along the coastlines. Fleets struggled to find funds while desert flanks stayed open. North Africa, with its estates, ports and oil-producing lands, moved into the orbit of the Caliphate. This was not only land changing hands, it was the empire's farm and money cord draining away. Workshops reliant on Egyptian papiers and Eastern trade closed. Garrison pay fell behind. The capital still shone, but the budget that sustained it shrank. The Umayyad Caliphate then tested the center itself. Between 674 and 678, Arab fleets and armies set bases along the Sea of Marmara and pressed the capital by season. Constantinople, ringed by water and walls, endured bombardment and blockade. Supply by sea became the difference between holding and collapse. The defenders used a new weapon, Greek fire, shot from bronze tubes on ships and walls. Its flames stuck to hulls and spread across waves, breaking formations and burning crews who could not put it out. The siege unraveled and the attackers withdrew. The struggle returned on a bigger scale in 717 and 718. The Umayyads came back with a fleet and army on the Thracian shore. Emperor Leo II coordinated the defense, tightened rationing, and kept fleets moving to contest the straits. Winter punished the Visigoths. Supply lines failed. Sickness and hunger cut ranks. Greek fire struck again in night actions that shattered squadrons at anchor. By spring the siege collapsed. The capital stood on the borders, settled into a long war of raid and treaty, not decisive invasion. That survival mattered far beyond the streets. The line held at Constantinople blocked an eastern route into Europe. It set limits later politics and faith would inherit. The empire that emerged from these trials was smaller and more guarded. Command shifted toward mobile defense, fortified themes in Anatolian and a navy made to keep the lifeline to the capital open. Gold moved more carefully. Soldiers farmed land for service and policy, aimed at endurance, not grand reconquest. Byzantium had been wounded, but it learned the habits that would keep it alive. Here's a striking fact: Greek fire's recipe stayed in one family's care for generations, and enemy crews sometimes turned back at the sight of the tubes alone. By the mid-7th century, the empire looked smaller, poor, and stretched to its limits. Syria, Egypt, and much of North Africa had slipped away. Raids hit Anatolia and the Balkans in repeat seasons. The treasury paid more for defense while collecting less from emptied lands. Garrison towns that once drew support from distant provinces now had to fend for themselves. Collapse was a real risk. Yet the state still had a core: Constantinople, a working navy, and the memory of organized rule. The response was structural, not cosmetic. Emperors reordered the map into themes of framework that put military and civil power in the same hands at the regional level. Each theme was a command zone with a strategos who answered directly to the capital. He managed local courts, tax collection, and border patrols, so decisions did not wait on slow messengers. The logic was speed and accountability. If an army had to gather, the same official who oversaw farms and roads could raise men, move grain, and fix bridges without fights over authority. Soldiers received land, grants died to service. Families held plots if a man in each household came with arms when cold. Over time, this service became hereditary, building a pool of trained fighters spread across the countryside. That arrangement cut costs for the treasury. Farmers who were soldiers fed themselves, kept their gear in mounts, and needed less cash from the center. State pay still mattered, but the burden fell off the imperial payroll and onto the new military farming communities. The results changed reasons to fight. When riders crossed to pass, defenders stood up for their own field. Units knew the land, the water sources, and the choke points. They could rally fast because muster points were close and orders moved through one office. Frontier forces became stubborn, local, and hard to remove. Big invasions still caused damage, but small and medium strikes met organized resistance. not empty watches. This system also studied daily life with a stratego S cases, found quicker judgment and road work, did not wait for a distant ministry. Small towns rebuilt walls, reopened markets, and restarted work. As harvests normalized, population loss slowed and then reversed in parts of Anatolia. The state still taxed, but collections matched the seasonal rhythm of farming families, who knew their duties and what protection they got in return. Identity shifted alongside administration. The state moved away from grand projects and toward lasting routines. Latin faded from official use, while Greek became the language of orders, courts, and contracts. Church life set the public calendar, and bishops worked with regional commanders to coordinate aid in bad years and to support garrisons near shrines and monasteries. The empire looked less like Rome and more like a compact, disciplined commonwealth that prized survival. Thematic order did not solve every problem. Court politics continued, and some commanders grew strong enough to threaten the palace. Yet the framework held through shocks and bought time. It lowered fixed military costs, increased response speed, and kept core provinces in imperial hands. From this leaner base, later rulers could bargain, rebuild fleets, and sponsor learning. The groundwork for revival lay in those farmer soldiers and their officers. It was a striking fact this system kept Byzantium alive against larger, richer rivals for centuries, and some historians rate it among the most efficient military administrative designs ever made. As border raids slowed and local armies settled into the thematic rhythm, a different kind of battle opened inside churches and home. The argument was not over land, but what holy images meant and whether they belonged in worship at all. Families had icons near doorways and lampstands. Processions carried painted panels through streets on feast days. Emperors sent gifts of images to monasteries as signs of favor. These habits made icons part of daily faith and public life. Icons mattered because people treated them as points of contact. A believer could kiss a painted Christ or the Virgin light up and ask for help before a saint's image. Priests held them over the sick. Soldiers wore small images into battle. The visuals taught belief to those who could not read and organized memory around faces, gestures, and scenes. For many, removing them would feel like tearing pages from the faith's living book. Yet critics doubted that link. They worried that respect blurred into worship and that painting would distract attention from God. Military losses against a rising Islamic caliphate, which banned religious images, sharpened the question. If an icon-free rival prospered while Byzantium struggled, some asked whether divine favor required removing images. The debate moved from sermons to palaces because policy could change, which stood on church walls across the empire. Emperor Leo, already known for defending the capital, pushed the issue into law around 726. Orders went out to take down icons from public places and churches. Officials replaced them with crosses or plain decoration. The policy got a name: iconoclasm, and it split communities. Iconoclasts argued they protected true worship and curbed superstition. Icon lovers answered that honor paid to an image passed to the person shown and that the incarnation itself justified portraying Christ in matter. The split ran through neighborhoods and families. Bishops issued conflicting rulings. City crowds rioted when favorite images were taken. Monasteries turned into centers for resistance, not only because monks made icons, but because monastic teaching defended their role in prayer. The state responded with exile orders, seizures of monastic land, and trials that targeted vocal defenders. Altarpieces disappeared. Frescoes were scraped from walls. The loss left a generation with blank walls where belief had once been painted. Imperial rule did not stay constant. After periods of destruction, a change on the throne could relax rules. Then a new ruler could enforce removal again. Over a century, this back and forth created cycles of rebuilding under a sewer. The uncertainty trained artists to work in subtler ways and pushed some craftsmen to nearby regions where patrons still ordered icon. In 787, Empress Irene gathered bishops for a council at Nicaea. They said icons held a proper place in worship that respect differed from worship and that images taught the faithful. For a time churches restored panels and mosaics, but the peace did not hold. Iconoclasm returned under later emperors, and only in 843 did a final settlement take hold. The return of icons became the triumph of orthodoxy, an annual celebration that marked the resolution as part of the empire's religious calendar. The effects reached far. Artistic styles grew with new caution and then with renewed confidence. The debate pushed theologians to define how matter could carry holiness. It also widened distance with the Latin West, where images stayed less contested and papal support for icons deepened mistrust. Some believers protected treasures through the worst years by walling them up, hiding them in cellars, or sewing small images into clothes, carrying them safely across city gates. Basil I's story starts far from court. He worked as a stable hand and bodyguard before sharp wits and physical skill pulled him into elite circles. Through support and marriage ties, he rose to the throne in 867 and set the tone for a family line that prized order, method, and steady gains. His rise signaled a break from crisis management toward planned recovery. The palace made ministries professional, gave clear tasks, and the army took its cues from leaders who meant to keep victories, not just win them. This stretch of rule is often called the Macedonian Renaissance. The label fits because institutions regained rhythm, generals improved the borders, and culture moved forward on several fronts at once. Emperors from Basil I through his successors focused decision-making, disciplined tax collection, and asserted control over provincial magnates who had grown rich from wartime trouble. The result was fewer private armies and a state with enough strength to move grain, silver, and soldiers where needed. Land administration got special care. Compilers reorganized rules into clear handbooks, fixing steps for judges and governors who had worked from scattered orders. Training for officials stressed record-keeping, standard contracts, and audit trails. With clearer rules, disputes moved faster and corruption faced tighter checks. The court also refined ceremonies using processions and investitures to reinforce ranks and teach provincial envoys how authority worked. A stronger frame helped the economy rebound. Farm states in Asia Minor grew more food with irrigation, repairs, and new settlements. Tax lists steadied as people returned to farms under secure soldiers. Craftsmen in Constantinople and Thessaloniki made silk jewelry, glass, and military gear, feeding a trade system that linked the Aegean to the Black Sea and the Levant. Merchants moved cargo onto safer sea routes, and coins moved with reliable weight, encouraging savings and credit. Learning followed prosperity. Scholars copied and commented on classical Greek texts, keeping the language exact and the tradition whole. Works of Homer, Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid returned to classrooms in corrected versions, while scribes made many copies that went into monasteries and private libraries. Compilers gathered encyclopedias, its collections of speech and guides for ruling that shaped how students argued, wrote, and governed. Writing tightened arguments became more structured, and authors aimed for clarity over decoration. Art and architecture grew into a distinct, confident style. Icon painters refined faces and gestures into calm, bright forms made for prayer, not show. Mosaicists slayed gold backgrounds that caught candlelight and defined holy space, using careful geometry to frame figures with balance and order. Churches multiplied their domes, set on strong piers, interiors lined with marble panels and floors cut in patterned stone that guided movement from entrance to nave. Power reached outward through careful diplomacy and military campaigns. Field armies backed by the thematic base pressed gains in the Balkans, and alone envoys arranged marriages and tribute deals that extended influence without constant occupation. Religious missions traveled with this policy. In the Slavic lands, teachers brought worship in the local tongue and made scripts that kept translation stable. From this work grew the Cyrillic tradition and a Christian, even Rus, which aligned elites with Byzantine rites and art. By the mid-10th century, the capital wrote with assurance, minted with confidence and sent orders across seasoned passes, expecting obedience. The Macedonian era rebuilt a clear identities, entered unorthodox worship, Greek learning and imperial continuity. Basil takes the throne without showing, without patience for glamour. He cuts the extras of court life, wears plain clothes and keeps his household lean. He eats like a soldier, drills like one, and spends his best years sleeping under canvas. Anyone looking for a court showman finds a commander who counts coins, measures grain, and watches the frontiers closer than he watches banquets. His early years are a fight inside the empire. Great landholding families in Anatolia treat provinces like private estates and officers like clients. Their wealth buys followers, their web of marriages buys influence, and their aim bends towards self-rule. Basil meets them with inquiries, confiscations, and marching orders. He breaks up their estates, moves loyal governors into key districts, and makes sure the tax list answer to the palace. Revolts flare. He does not bargain them down. He surrounds, isolates, and pulls their leaders from the chain of command. By the time the dust settles, the emperor's word reaches the villages again. With the house in order, Basil turns to the war that will define him. The Bulgarian Empire holds strong spots in the Balkans with forts strung across passes and rivers. The fighting is slow and hard. Campaign seasons grind across ridge lines, through ravines, and around stone walls that must be starved, not stormed. Basil studies maps, rotates soldiers, and leans on engineers. Supplied EPOs anchor his advances. New forts lock down roads after each push. He does not chase glory with single battles. He applies pressure year after year until the Bulgarian line begins to thin. The campaign hardens both sides. Columns creep through mountain fog. Scouts test crossings. And winter closes in before pay chests do. Basil accepts the pace because it fits his method. He pulls allies where possible, but relies on discipline, steady supply, and a habit of returning to the field even after a tough season. The war becomes the rhythm of his reign. In 1014 at Clyde on Patience Bays, Basil traps a large Bulgarian force in a narrow valley. His troops block exits, fill the slopes with barriers, and press from the front. The collapse yields thousands of prisoners. His order is blunt, blind, and sparing 1 in 100 with a single eye to lead the rest home. When the broken columns reach their rulers, as Samuel the shot kills him. From that day, the name that spreads with Basil is the Bulgar Slayer. The resistance bends. Forts give up. Basil folds Bulgaria into the imperial structure, sending officials to take oaths, count fields, and enroll soldiers. The borders stretch from the Adria to the Black Sea. Tax boost. Along rivers add new money. Garrison towns along the Danube fill with veterans. Patrols on the frontier find more quiet than trouble. The treasury grows under strict accounting. Provinces send taxes on time. The army stays drilled, paid, and rotated with units seasoned by long campaigns. Threats on other fronts test the borders, but the lines hold. For the first time in centuries, the empire's map looks confident. Basil leaves a state that is wealthy, orderly, and feared. He leaves no equal to replace him. After his death, courtiers return to games, and successors lean on the system he built. Without his steel to guard at the edges begin to fray. For all that the measure of his rule stands hard iron, long patience, and a will that kept marching. He spent so much time in the field that the gilded halls might as well have been for unsoiled to him. Basil's death in 1025 left a full treasury, a drilled army, and borders held by forts he had secured. But the strength of that system depended on his watch. Without his care, the court relaxed. Those who followed spent more time on ceremonies, followers, and favors than on rosters and supply line. Palaces grew busy, barracks grew quiet. Senior posts went to favorites, not hardened officers. The habits that kept the frontiers steady began to slip. As courtiers competed, great families in Anatolia pressed their advantage. They bought out small holders, took over village plots, and stretched their estates across valleys that had once fed soldier farmers. With land came authority. Local judges and tax officials answered to magnates, not the capital. The state's hold on recruitment weakened. Men who had served as part-time horsemen and the themes drifted off the rolls or showed up under a lord's banner instead of the imperial eagle. Ranks thinned. Musters came up short. To fill gaps, emperors hired muscle. Contracts went to Normans from the west, Pecheneg riders from the steppe, and Turk helpers skilled with horse bows. They could fight, but they fought for coin. Delayed pay and desertion. A richer offer meant switching sides. Commanders learned to keep a chest close and an eye on the camp gate. Meanwhile, the treasury lost depth. As aristocrats ring-fenced, estates' taxable land shrank. Court projected payments, and gifts rose faster than money coming in. Auditors found more exemptions than taxes owed. Abroad pressure mounted. In southern Italy, Norman adventurers tested Byzantine soldiers and took towns from imperial governors. In the Balkans, Pecheneg raids burned fields and pulled captives across the Danube. Most dangerous of all were the Seljuk Turks, whose raids cut into eastern Anatolia. Their speed showed the empire's slower under-strength units. Raiding seasons pushed deeper each year, interrupting planting and trade and turning frontier cities into nervous islands. Politics turned erratic. Generals with a taste for power made bids for the throne. Ministers built groups, traded bribes, and switched loyalties when the wind changed. The palace answered coups with coups. A ruler crowned in spring might be removed, blinded, or sent to a monastery by winter. Each turn overpushed experienced officials out and brought uncertain hands in. Orders conflicted. Tax policy changed mid-year, and provincial governors hedged their bets, waiting to see who ruled next month. The army felt the confusion most. Senior officers reshuffled. With each regime change, plans were rewritten, and long-term wall projects stalled. Units that once strained together spread to protect nobles' lands or sat idle awaiting clear commands. On campaign, coordination broke down. Scouts arrived late, wagons lagged, and small defeats multiplied into retreats. Soldiers paid late, fed poorly, and led by strangers lost the confidence that had defined Basil's ranks. By the 1062, the map still looked respectable and the titles still sounded grand, but the pillars were hollowing. The themes no longer produced steady cavalry. The hired corps demanded silver. The state struggled to find in the frontier people, or the cost of raids commanders could not stop. When Romano Savi came to power, he inherited resources, forts, and a name that still carried weight. He also inherited a court split by rivalries, officers bound to patrons, and an army that looked strong on paper yet moved like a body out of practice. 13 emperors in 46 years had left scars numbers could not hide. Romanos Iv Iogenes took the purple with a clear goal: restore order in the ranks and stop the Seljuk advance, slicing into Anatolia. He knew where the empire breathed. Anatolia supplied the men who filled the regiments the grain, that fed them the horses, that moved them, and the taxes that kept the system alive. If the high Platos slipped away, the empire's core would crack. He set out to rebuild field discipline, check musters, and put a general's eye back on the eastern road. He gathered a large army, but the force reflected the politics of the time. It held dependable tag, motto, and provincial units, used to marching in formation. Mixed among them stood hired men under contract, local levies, called on short notice, and foreign groups whose loyalty followed paymasters. The roster looked impressive. The cohesion was uneven. Romanos tried to shape them into a single engine, with drills, clear routes, and stockpiled supplies. He needed a wind that would stiffen spines and warn the tribes crossing the frontier. Across the line stood Alparslan, a commander who preferred movement to show. He kept his cavalry light, his scouts active, and his battles on his term. His riders cut at foragers, pulled advance guards into false chases, and pressed only when the ground and timing favored them. He avoided set combat until he saw an opening he could widen. That habit turned Byzantine caution into overreach. In 1071, the imperial host reached Manzikert, near Lake Van, aiming to take forts, secure passes, and draw the Seljuks into a fight they could not refuse. The staff work assumed predictable opposition. It must read the speed of Seljuk detachments and the reach of their patrols. Skirmishers nipped at the columns. Signals grew confused. Orders to concentrate, mixed with orders to scout further, and units drifted away from one another. The fault line widened inside the command tent. Ironicus Stauk, as a general, with his own interests at court, distrusted the emperor and the campaign. During the critical phase, as the center pressed forward and the wings tried to hold, he pulled his reserve back. The withdrawal opened the gap and stripped Romanos of his safety net. What looked like a measured advance turned into exposure. Seljuk horse archers flowed into the space circling the Byzantine line and showering it with arrows. They probed for weak points, shut down retreat paths, and kept the infantry turning instead of moving. Thus noise and conflicting commands broke formation. Once the rear felt pressure and the flanks wavered, the line collapsed by sections. Romanus fought with the guard, but found himself isolated, his banner surrounded. He was taken alive. Alparslan did not stage a show of revenge. He treated the captive emperor with formal respect, set terms the treasury could meet, and released him. The campaign, however, lay in ruins. Romanos returned to the capital, where rivals had prepared their move. They removed him, ordered his blinding, and sent him into exile. A soldier emperor who had sought to steady the frontier fell to Pallas arithmetic. The field loss at Manzi Kurt broke more than a campaign plan. Control over the Anatolian interior unraveled. Turkish tribes moved and settled and stitched new routes across the plateau. With recruitment grounds, Kutantak's district lost, the imperial machine lost its balance and momentum. In less than a decade, central Anatolia slipped from Byzantine hands, a region held for centuries. The date stands as a pivot in medieval war and in the story of an empire's long decline. The treasury was thin, and warlords, for unraiders and ambitious courtiers, split the empire's attention. Provinces still showed imperial colors, but garrisons lacked pay, and orders, and the roads into the capital carried more pleas than grain. That is the world Alexios Psyche, Omn Enos, walked into in 1081, taking the throne with a promise to stabilize the heart of the state before the shell cracked apart. Alexios started by tightening command. He folded scattered officers back under the palace-trimmed overlapping authorities and placed trustworthy kin and veterans where decisions moved too slowly. Army rolls were purged of ghost names, and commanders who owed rank to flattery instead of service were replaced. He rebuilt the field forces around reliable core units and attached lighter, faster groups to harass enemies who had learned to avoid set fights. Fortresses guarding the approaches to the capital received repairs, fresh soldiers, and supply stores that could hold out when campaigns went wrong. Money powered everything, so he reworked revenue. Tax exemptions nobles had treated as hereditary perks were reviewed, narrowed, or cancelled. Inspectors counted estates that had expanded quietly during years of chaos, bringing land back onto the list. Customs officers were rotated unaudited. Money that once fed court payments and shows moved toward barrack shipyards and storehouses along the straits. The goal was simple: cash first to units that could stop a raid from becoming a migration. Alexios used diplomacy like a campaign plan. He balanced enemies against each other, cut deals with one threat to counter another, and bought time wherever he could. When pressure along the front exceeded what his reorganized army could manage, he looked west for helps, seeking limited groups to shore up Anatolian routes in coastal town. The appeal reached churchmen and princes, who answered with a movement far larger than he expected. The flood of crusading armies was unruly, but it could be steered. Through oaths and logistics, Alexios got backland all along the Aegean Rim and in western Anatolia, bringing ports and key road hubs back into the imperial network. His son Jonai kept the machine steady rather than flashy. He led careful campaigns that cleared threats along frontiers, reinforced alliances that worked, and refused overreach. Garrisons stayed, supplied fort lines were maintained, and the government sent funds with fewer lapses. Stability, not spectacle, defined his years, and the map looked safer because of it. Manuel Icon and Enos pushed outward with more ambition. He tested imperial weight in the Balkans, talked with Italian powers while pressuring them at sea and sought influence in the eastern Mediterranean through both arms and marriages. Planning grew more complex, fleets grew busier and embassies multiplied. The court shone again, not in empty display, but in scholarship's ceremony and an economy that hummed with trade crossing the harbours. Caravans met convoys, craftsmen filled markets, and the capital sold protection and prestige as well as goods. Yet the Restoration had limits. It leaned on strong rulers making constant adjustments, on allies that needed reasons, and on a military rebuilt for resilience more than conquest. When Manuel eyed the balances he kept began to wobble. Groups resurfaced, rivals circled, and partners abroad watched for openings. As Crusader states shifted, Venice grew bolder. The empire's margin for error narrowed in the very waters that had enriched Constantinople and made it the city travellers called the richest on earth. Alexio Sai asked for professional groups, supply contracts, and shipping to help retake the fortified towns that anchored western Anatolia. What arrived in 1096 was a mass movement of lords, knights, and camp followers driven by vows and relics, not by Byzantine plans. They crossed imperial lands on their own timetables, answered to their own commanders, and bargained hard at every gate. Alexios made them swear oaths where he could map their routes and used escorts to keep order. But the scale ensured friction from the first crossing of the Bosporus. Once in the Levant, the Crusaders worked as independent bands. They talked with local powers, fought over plunder, and placed garrisons in cities they considered prizes of faith. Byzantine officers expected the return of former imperial towns after capture. Crusading leaders judged commitments case by case. That mismatch set the tone. Campaign by campaign, they stood side by side against common foes, then quarreled over who held the keys afterward. Mutual doubt deepened with every meeting. Imperial diplomats read the armies from the west as unpredictable, brave in attack, loose in discipline, quick to draw swords in markets or monasteries. Western writers in turn described Byzantine officers as skilled at delay to smooth and talk, and more focused on tariffs and treaties than on battlefield zeal. Both claimed to guard Christianity. Both kept counting the other's ships and tallies. Even with the strain Byzantium gained early, coastal strongholds in Asia Minor returned to the imperial network. Harbours reopened to tax trade. Roads from the Aegean to the plateau could be patrolled and supplied again. The belt of cities along the coast fed money into the arsenal and paid for soldiers that watched the interior. For a time the frontier steadied. Later, crusading waves complicated every game. Lords from the Latin states pressed beyond what imperial charters allowed, keeping forts they had sworn to hand back and issuing their own grants over farmland once logged in Byzantine registers. Appeals and talks dragged while walls were reinforced and new settlers arrived. Each delay hardened facts on the ground. Meanwhile, Venice rose from partner to rival. Early in Alexios' reign, the empire traded wide customs freedoms for naval strength. Venetian convoys secured sea lanes under escorted troop ships, but their privileges multiplied. Quays, warehouses, and entire street grids in the capital fell under Venetian rule. Their courts handled disputes inside those districts. Fees shrank for their cargo and profits flowed north across the Adriatic. By mid-century, Venice could blockade or supply the straits on its own term. Inside the empire, stability slipped. Imperial succession reopened groups, corps, and ministries, turned over with each new support network. Commanders leaned harder on hired companies, Norman lancers, steppe horsemen, and Italian sailors, whose contracts drained coin and whose loyalties followed pay notices. Every crisis demanded cash first, policy second. Diplomacy became a puzzle with moving edges. Envoys moved between Crusader courts, Venetian councils, Norman princes in southern Italy, and powers in Egypt and Syria. One agreement often risked another. A deal that secured a convoy might angle an ally. A pledge to a Latin prince could undercut a Byzantine claim to a city. By the late 1100s, the fabric of cooperation was thin. Grievances piled up and paid debts, broken oaths, seizures of docks, arrests of merchants. Trust gave way to calculation. The empire had survived sieges, sickness and border collapses by managing enemies. Now the danger gathered inside its trade routes and harbours in the hands of those who sailed under the cross yet bargained like conquerors. Venetian merchants controlled entire districts of Constantinople with their own markets and courts, a city within the city waiting for a spark. The Fourth Crusade was meant to sail against Egypt, a rich target that could undercut Ayyubid power and open the road to Jerusalem. It never reached the Nile. Crusade leaders contracted with Venice for a massive fleet. Shipwrights and sailors worked for months, and the bill came due on a day the armies could not meet it. Too few crusaders arrived, and those who did lacked the cash. The republics all average. If the crusade could not pay in coin, it could pay in service. That service would point toward Venetian interest. Debt set the route. Venice first redirected the host to attack its Aryo-Christian rival on the Adriatic to cover part of the arrears. From there the expedition drifted from papal intent to commercial math. Meanwhile, Byzantine politics cracked open a larger chance. In exile was a young claimant, Alexios Angelos, who promised the crusade in Venice a package that solved everything on paper. Money to clear the debt, troops to support their campaigns, and church union to ease friction with Rome. All he needed was the throne of his removed father restored in Constantinople. The army and fleet set a course for the Bosporus. After bombardments and assaults along the sea walls, the current regime buckled, and Alexios was crowned alongside his blind father as Alexios IV. The Crusaders waited for payment. The new emperor searched for funds he did not control, tried to raise taxes in a hostile city, and found that imperial treasuries were not bottomless chests. Weeks stretched into months. Riot prices spiked. Coin was minted with less silver, and guards clashed with Latin detachments over supplies and lodgings. Tension filled the streets. Greek-speaking crowds saw foreign soldiers housed in monasteries and warehouses. Latin merchants demanded protection and priority at the docks. Fires broke out after brawls. Rumors of plots raced through both camps. The court splintered again. Ica removed Alexios IV and replaced him with a ruler unwilling to pay or tolerate the Latin presence. The Crusaders now stood in front of the greatest walled city in the Mediterranean, with no money, no sponsor at court, and no safe exit. The calculation narrowed to a single choice. In April 1204 they attacked. Venetian ships with boarding bridges took sections of the sea walls. Assault parties forced gates. Fires spread through districts as defenders fell back and breaks widened under repeated pushes. The Theodosia N walls, symbols of centuries of sieges, endured, then failed under division inside and coordinated strikes outside. Once the defences broke, order vanished. The sack lasted 3 days. Churches were stripped. Relics and icons were pulled down. Libraries and writing rooms burned. Palaces were emptied of plate. Textiles and mosaic expired from their settings. House by house valuables changed hands. Families were dragged into slavery. Thousands died in the streets or in churches that could not protect them. Barges and wagons loaded treasures bound for Venetian vaults. The cultural loss could not be counted. Manuscripts that linked late antique learning to the present vanished. Reliquary Arisen chalices crossed the Adriatic, many to rest in Venetian churches. Bronze horses that stood above the hippodrome were taken and mounted at street marks. On the ruins the conquerors declared all at an empire dividing lands and offices. Byzantine elites escaped to Nicaea, Epirus and Trebizond, where rival courts claimed continuity and plotted return. The blow was structural. Wealth that funded fleets and pay was gone. Prestige collapsed with the plunder of the capital. Even after a Byzantine restoration decades later, the empire returned smaller, poorer and dependent on powers that had just sacked its heart. Many medieval watchers marked 1204 for not 1453 as the moment Byzantium lost its core, its art and its identity. By the mid-1400 seconds, the Byzantine Empire had narrowed to Constantinople and a few coastal holdings and forts. Trade had thinned, tax districts had vanished and the court ruled a capital surrounded by a rising Ottoman power. The city's defences still stood on their ancient lines, but the empire behind them was a memory. Centuries of war, disrupted money and family failures had reduced a superpower to a walled enclave. Mehmed I, young and determined, took the Ottoman throne with a plan that joined strategy to symbol. Constantinople controlled the straits, promised customs money, and sat between the empire's Balkan and Anatolian lands. Taking it would also claim the legacy of Rome. He reorganized administration, secured supply lines to the siege area, and brought in artisans, miners and engineers to build what earlier armies lacked. Heavy sustained firepower that could break stone instead of waiting it out. The Ottoman host gathered with discipline. Janissaries formed the professional corps, drilled for assaults and counterattacks. Provincial levies dug trenches, dragged bundles, and kept a constant flow of materials to the front. Artillery crews prepared bombards and smaller guns to batter towers and walls. Most striking was a giant cannon cast from metal thick enough to stand repeated shots, capable of throwing massive stone balls that cracked masonry and shook foundations with each hit. Facing this was Constantine's imply logos. He had few men, fewer resources, and no illusion about the odds. Still, he refused to withdraw aloft and stayed at the walls, organizing sectors, setting schedules, and sharing risk with Italian captains and local units. His stance turned the defense into a statement: protect the city's people and its memory. Even if help fleets never arrived, treaties offered only delay. The siege opened with encirclement by land and the blocking of the harbor exits by sea. The Theodosia and walls, triple-layered lines that had stopped generations of enemies, were racked by time and thinly met. Defenders numbered only a few thousand Greek soldiers, Genoese and Venetian volunteers, and townspeople. They patched trouble with timber and earth, hauled stones back into place, and rotated under bombardment on a schedule that strained every hour of daylight. Artillery set the tempo. Week after week, bombardment widened gaps into breaks. Mining teams tried to collapse sections. Counterminers listened for picks and answered with fires and cave-ins. Night trades spiked ladders and burned shelters. Daylight returned to drums and gunfire. Food stretched, morale wavered, unsteadied, and envoys moved without producing terms either side could accept. Before dawn on May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched a layered assault. Irregulars tested gaps, drawing missiles and tiring the line. Better troops followed, pressing at the weakest points, while artillery renewed its pounding. Finally, Janissaries advanced in ordered waves. A gate sector gave a banner, fell, and formations broke into the city's streets. Fighting surged around intersections, churches, and barricades. Constantine's died in the crush, still in armor, and was never securely found among the dead. Once resistance collapsed, Mem had entered Hagia Sophia and ordered its change into a mosque. The city changed hands and purpose in a single procession. After more than 11 centuries, the Byzantine Empire ended with the fall of Constantinople. Rome's last remnant closed its account. Yet Orthodox tradition, art, architecture, diplomacy, and the book scholars carried out would keep shaping other states and cultures. Many of those scholars reached Italian cities with manuscripts and methods that fed a movement already stirring, one that marked the end of the medieval world and the start of another. And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered, some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening, and until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.